By 1546, King Henry VIII was not a man anymore. He was a corpse waiting for permission to die. He was 55 years old, weighed around 400 pounds, and couldn't walk. Not because he didn't want to, but because his legs were literally rotting. His once powerful body had become a prison. The smell alone kept most people at a distance. It wasn't just bad, it was unbearable. Courtiers wrote that his chamber stank of putrefaction. That's the word they used, putrefaction, like a dead body. And that wasn't exaggeration. The King of England, ruler of one of the most powerful nations in Europe, reeked like a man already in the ground. Years of ulcers on his legs had become infected beyond repair. The wounds never closed. They oozed pus and blood, soaking through bandages and bedsheets. Some days the doctors didn't even bother trying to clean them. They just opened the wounds with knives to let the fluid drain. Henry would scream, loudly. Even in the next room you'd hear it. And this wasn't happening in some back alley. This was in palaces, Hampton Court, Whitehall, surrounded by silk tapestries and gold plate, but no wealth in the world could save him. His body had turned on him. He used to be athletic, handsome even. That was gone. His face was bloated, his skin cracked and blistered, and he had to be carried in a special chair because his legs wouldn't hold him. He had once jousted for hours. Now servants had to hoist him into bed using ropes and pulleys. But here's the real horror. Henry knew it. He wasn't deluded. He told people he was dying. He obsessed over it. Every ache, every cough, he asked his physicians if it was the end. He made them swear they'd tell him when death was close. He didn't want to die suddenly. He wanted time to control it. Because Henry VIII had spent decades controlling death. He had killed wives, friends, monks, cardinals. Now death was coming for him, and he couldn't stop it. He kept revisiting his will, making changes, then undoing them. He'd write out who should rule after him, then change it a week later. He no longer trusted his council. He no longer trusted anyone. And his pain wasn't just physical, it was mental. This was a man who believed God had made him king, and now God was stripping him apart piece by piece. He saw every ulcer, every drop of pus as punishment, and deep down he didn't think he'd earned heaven. A man who had once stood tall as defender of the faith now feared hell more than anything. And that's the state he lived in, day after day, month after month, rotting, paranoid, in agony. This was the most powerful man in England, and he was dying piece by piece in his own filth. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. We want to know how far these forgotten stories reach. By late 1546, Henry VIII's bedchamber had become a place most people dreaded entering. His massive body barely fit in the custom-made bed. The sheets had to be changed constantly. When they weren't soaked with sweat, they were soaked with pus and blood, sometimes both. Servants worked in silence. The smell was overpowering. The infection in his leg ulcers had become so foul, some described it as the smell of meat left out in the sun for weeks. One ambassador wrote that the king could hardly move without shrieking in pain. He wasn't exaggerating. Henry's ulcers weren't just open wounds. They were deep holes bored into his legs by years of injury and unchecked infection. The medical treatments were brutal by today's standards. They would stick metal probes into the wounds to clear out dead tissue. Then they'd pack the openings with cloth soaked in wine, vinegar, or worse, boiling oil, to cauterize the infection. Imagine being held down while someone pours scalding liquid into your flesh, and if that didn't work, they'd slice away the rotting flesh with knives. They called it debridement. Henry called it agony. He screamed, every time, loud enough that everyone in the next room would stop what they were doing. He cursed his doctors. He wept. Some days he'd beg them not to treat him, but if they didn't, the rot would spread faster. He knew it. They all knew it. The king didn't sleep much. The pain kept him awake. He'd lash out at anyone nearby, servants, guards, even his wives if they were around. Once he threw a silver crucifix across the room because a priest dared ask him to confess his sins. He feared death, but more than death, he feared damnation. At night he muttered prayers under his breath. Not long ago he'd called himself Supreme Head of the Church of England. Now he wanted forgiveness from a God he wasn't sure was still listening. He hadn't forgotten what he did to the monasteries or to his wives. And the staff hadn't forgotten either. Many of them had served Henry since his youth. They'd seen the change. He'd once been tall, fit, charismatic. Now he looked like a bloated corpse that just hadn't been buried yet. But they couldn't say that. No one could. Everyone lied to him.
Your Majesty looks better today. The swelling is going down. The infection is healing.
It wasn't. The infection was killing him slowly. But to speak the truth meant losing your position, or worse. In Henry's court, honesty often ended at the scaffold. Even touching him was dangerous. Servants used gloves when they cleaned him. Some wore cloth over their faces to keep from gagging. A few fainted, one vomited. And worst of all, he was still king. Even bedridden, even half dead, Henry made decisions that impacted the entire country. That bed, soaked in his own fluids, was the seat of English power. From that bed, he still signed death warrants. In his final months, the King of England was a man barely clinging to life, wrapped in linen stained with decay, lashed to existence by a court too terrified to let him go. They didn't pity him. They feared him, and he feared himself. By the time Henry VIII entered his final winter, his court had become a snake pit. Everyone knew the king was dying. No one said it out loud. But behind every bow and smile was a calculation. What happens after Henry dies? Who gets power? Who gets punished? Henry was blind to none of it. He wasn't just sick. He was paranoid. He had good reason. His inner circle had been stacked with liars, flatterers, and opportunists for decades. Men like Thomas Wriothesley, Stephen Gardiner, Edward Seymour, names forgotten by most today but critical in Henry's final days, were all jockeying for control. Everyone was watching each other, recording what was said, passing notes to spies. Henry had trusted no one since the fall of Thomas Cromwell in 1540. Cromwell had been his architect, the man who gave Henry the legal weapons to dissolve monasteries, to annul marriages, to kill queens and call it law, and still Henry had him executed. That decision haunted him. In his sickbed, Henry ordered Cromwell's portrait brought back out of storage. He stared at it for hours. Some said he even wept. That's how twisted his reality had become. He destroyed the men he needed most, and he didn't know who to trust anymore. So he did what tyrants do when they feel weak. He tightened his grip. Even though he could barely move, Henry remained obsessed with control. He had scribes come to his bedside and read reports. Every word in his will had to be reviewed and rewritten. Every man on his council was scrutinized. He knew they wanted him gone, but no one could say it. That's what made it worse. It was a silent war. If you didn't show up to court, you were suspected of treason. If you came too often, you were seen as ambitious. Speak your mind, and you risked execution. Stay quiet, and you risked being forgotten. Even Henry's own doctors feared telling him the truth. They couldn't say, "Your Majesty, you're dying." That was treason. Saying the king would die meant doubting God's anointed. So they lied. "You're improving. The infection's retreating. Rest and you'll be stronger tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. Instead, Henry grew more bitter, more frightened, and more dangerous. He ordered that the guards in his chamber be rotated daily, never the same men twice. He demanded that his food be tested by multiple tasters. He accused servants of poisoning him. He had tapestries checked for hidden messages. This wasn't just paranoia. It was self-preservation from a man who'd lived by eliminating threats, and now he saw them everywhere. Even his own children weren't safe. He feared Edward would be manipulated. He feared Mary might try to return England to the Pope. He feared Elizabeth was too sharp for her own good. He had spent decades breaking the rules of succession. Now he wasn't sure who should rule after him. That's what happens when you kill your wives, your advisors, your friends. You run out of people to trust. Henry VIII ruled with fear for 36 years. At the end, fear ruled him. His courtiers called him "Your Grace," but no one believed in grace anymore. They only believed in power. And when the king finally died, they planned to take it before his body was even cold. But he wasn't dead yet. And even as his body collapsed, Henry still had blood to spill. Henry VIII didn't stop killing when he got sick. He couldn't ride, he couldn't stand, but he could still sign death warrants, and he did, right up until the very end. In December 1546, just weeks before his death, Henry ordered the arrest of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. Surrey wasn't just a nobleman. He was the son of the Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful men in England. His crime, designing a coat of arms that included the royal arms. That was it. In Henry's mind, it looked too much like a claim to the throne. Treason. Surrey had fought in wars for Henry. He was a poet, a soldier, a decorated noble. None of that mattered. He was taken to the Tower of London and sentenced to death. But that wasn't the worst part. Henry wanted more. Surrey's father, the Duke of Norfolk, had served the Tudor crown for decades. He was loyal, he had crushed rebellions, but he was also Catholic and old, and Henry hated old men who reminded him of his past. So he signed Norfolk's death warrant too. Both father and son were set to be executed. Surrey was beheaded on January 19, 1547, at Tower Hill. Norfolk was saved by timing. Henry died the night before the execution was scheduled. The warrant hadn't been carried out yet. Norfolk would rot in the Tower for years, but he lived barely. That's how Henry operated until the end, paranoid, cruel, and eager to destroy anyone he thought might challenge his legacy, even if it meant wiping out families that had been loyal for generations. But nothing shows Henry's brutality in his final days more than the case of Anne Askew. She was arrested months earlier, in July 1546. Anne was 25 years old, a Protestant, a preacher. She believed in the English Bible and rejected the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, the idea that bread literally becomes the body of Christ. That belief got her labeled a heretic. Anne was interrogated, tortured, and condemned to die. Not just die, burned alive. But here's where it gets worse. She was tortured on the rack, even after her sentence was set, because the authorities wanted names of other Protestants. They wanted her to name Queen Catherine Parr. Yes, Henry's own wife. Anne said nothing. They stretched her so far on the rack her joints dislocated. Her body was ruined. She couldn't even walk to the stake. They had to carry her in a chair. She was burned at the stake on July 16, 1546, in Smithfield. Eyewitnesses wrote that her face never changed. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she just burned. Henry signed off on that execution. He knew about it, he approved it. He had married Catherine Parr because she was educated, Protestant, and good with children. But when rumors swirled that she was influencing him too much, making him too sympathetic to reformers, his court tried to tie her to Askew's heresy. Henry even allowed a warrant to be drafted for his own wife's arrest. Catherine Parr got lucky. She found out about it and threw herself at Henry's mercy. Told him she was just trying to distract him from his pain with spiritual talk. He believed her, barely. The warrant was dropped. But others didn't survive. Askew burned, Surrey beheaded, Norfolk came within hours of dying. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were a pattern, a dying king, desperate to control the narrative, lashing out at anyone he suspected of betrayal, disloyalty, or future disobedience. Even if they were innocent, even if they were young, even if they were family. In his last months on earth, Henry VIII didn't repent. He tightened the noose. That's how tyrants die. Catherine Parr was Henry's sixth wife, and she knew what came before her. She wasn't chosen for love. She was chosen because she was safe. At least, that's what everyone thought. She was a widow, twice. She was smart, well-educated, deeply religious, and most importantly, discreet. Henry needed someone who wouldn't challenge him, someone who would care for his children, especially Edward, the heir. Catherine was perfect on paper. But in practice, she was a problem. Not because she was reckless, not because she was unfaithful, because she was smart, too smart. Catherine was a devout Protestant. She believed in reform. She supported publishing the Bible in English. She held small study groups at court. She pushed Henry toward religious tolerance, even as he continued ordering Protestants burned at the stake. This was a dangerous game. Henry's court was split between hardline Catholics like Stephen Gardiner and reform-minded Protestants like Thomas Cranmer. They hated each other, and both sides were playing for the future of England. Catherine was caught in the middle, and the Catholics wanted her gone. So they watched and waited. Then they made their move. In the summer of 1546, just 6 months before Henry's death, Gardiner and Wriothesley presented the king with evidence. Catherine, they said, was promoting heresy. She was influencing the king's soul, leading him away from true faith. They told him she had been meeting with radical reformers behind his back. Henry listened. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He approved a warrant for her arrest. Just like that, Catherine Parr was one step from the scaffold. And here's the terrifying part. She didn't even know. Her enemies planned to arrest her during a walk with the king. She would be dragged away, interrogated and likely executed, just like Anne Boleyn, just like Catherine Howard. But someone warned her. We still don't know who. Maybe it was a sympathetic courtier. Maybe one of Henry's own staff who didn't want to see another queen butchered. Catherine didn't panic. She didn't run. She went straight to Henry's chamber. She threw herself at his feet and begged for mercy. She told him she had only ever discussed religion to distract him from his pain. She said she was trying to comfort him, not challenge him. She praised his wisdom. She flattered his ego. And it worked. Henry melted. He called her sweetheart. He cancelled the warrant. But just to drive the message home, the very next day, the guards showed up anyway, with the arrest order in hand. Henry laughed in front of Catherine. "You're too late," he said. "We're friends again." It was a warning. She had survived, but barely, and she never forgot it. From then on, Catherine said little. She kept her study groups private. She avoided discussing theology with the king. She focused on caring for Edward and Mary and Elizabeth, and she waited, quietly, patiently. Because she knew the truth, Henry's court wasn't about justice, it was about survival. Wives weren't partners, they were props, tools, tokens. And if you stepped 1 inch out of line, you didn't get a second chance. Anne Boleyn didn't, Catherine Howard didn't, even Jane Seymour died from giving birth. Catherine Parr survived because she understood something most people didn't. Henry didn't love anyone, not really. He only loved control. As 1547 began, Henry VIII was no longer ruling England. He was clinging to it. He couldn't stand, couldn't sleep, could barely speak some days, but he still demanded to be obeyed. He still summoned his council, still gave orders, and no one dared suggest the obvious, that the king was dying, not because it wasn't true, but because saying it out loud was dangerous. In Tudor England, even words could be treason, so everyone played the game. They bowed, they smiled, they pretended, even as the stench from his infected legs filled the palace halls. Henry's doctors knew, his council knew, his servants knew, the king was hours from death, but they lied to him anyway. Because the moment Henry died, everything would change. There'd be a scramble for power, alliances would collapse, men would turn on each other, and blood would likely spill. So they waited. Meanwhile, Henry's paranoia deepened. He obsessed over his will, not just once, but constantly. He rewrote sections, crossed out names, added allies, removed enemies. He knew his son Edward was only 9 years old, a child, vulnerable, surrounded by ambitious men, so Henry tried to control the future from his deathbed. He appointed 16 executors to rule until Edward came of age, but even those choices were made out of fear. He didn't trust any single man, not one, so he created a council of rivals, hoping they'd balance each other out. He thought chaos would prevent tyranny. But what he really did was plant the seeds for civil unrest. And while he scribbled names and commands, he refused to confess his sins. Henry VIII, the man who created the Church of England, never took last rites. Why? Because to do so meant admitting death was close, and if word spread that the king had accepted death, factions might rise early. Someone might move against his council, maybe even against his son. So he clung to power, even as it drained from his body. and he feared betrayal at every turn. He had his food checked multiple times before eating. No dishes were allowed unless approved by several guards. Letters were opened and read before reaching his hands. Some were burned, others rewritten by aides before being read aloud to him. The King of England lived in a cage of his own making. He demanded that certain men not be allowed near him. Stephen Gardiner, for instance, the conservative bishop who once held enormous sway, was barred from Henry's presence in the final weeks. No explanation given, just gone. Some said Gardiner had displeased the king. Others whispered that the reformers on the council had turned Henry against him. Either way, it didn't matter. When the king is dying, facts don't matter. Only perceptions do. And Henry perceived betrayal everywhere. He feared what would happen to his son. He feared that Mary might marry a foreign Catholic prince and undo everything he had fought for. He even feared Elizabeth's sharp intellect too much like her mother Anne Boleyn. He had spent his entire life bending the rules of succession to suit his will. Now, with death near, he realized those rules were written in sand. He tried to script the future. He tried to control it from beyond the grave. But the truth is, you can't, and deep down he knew it. So he rewrote his will again, gave land to allies, punished enemies, appointed men he barely trusted to protect his legacy. He dictated every last detail, even what should be carved on his tomb. He thought those words would outlive the stench, the rot, the blood. He was wrong, because no tomb can cover up what kind of man you really were. Henry VIII died in the early hours of January 28, 1547, in the Palace of Whitehall. No trumpets, no public statement, no official announcement, just silence. The men in his chamber didn't shout or mourn. They didn't tell anyone right away, because the moment Henry died, everything got dangerous. His death wasn't just the end of a man. It was the end of an entire system built around his power. The stakes were massive. England had a child king, now 9-year-old Edward VI. That meant regents, that meant factions, that meant opportunity. So the men in charge, most notably Edward Seymour, the boy king's uncle, kept the death quiet. For 3 days, they let the king's body rot in secret while they met in private, finalized documents, and locked down control of the Privy Council. Think about that. England had no king for 72 hours, and the people had no idea. When they finally announced Henry's death, they did it calmly, carefully. The message was rehearsed, the transition immediate. Edward Seymour was declared Lord Protector, effectively ruler of England, even though young Edward wore the crown. But let's talk about how Henry died. The man who ruled by violence, who burned people alive, who executed wives, who destroyed the Catholic Church in England, slipped into death the way tyrants usually do, painfully, slowly, and completely alone. He had no comfort, no dignity. His leg ulcers were so infected that his entire lower body was swollen. The pus had spread. His organs were shutting down. He likely died from kidney failure and sepsis, a full-body infection poisoning his blood. The same man who demanded obedience with a glance, who executed people for imagined crimes, died babbling in bed. His last words weren't famous. In fact, most witnesses didn't even record them. One servant claimed Henry whispered, "Monks, monks," in his final moments. No one knows why. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fear, maybe he was hallucinating. There was no priest, no confession, no comfort from God. The man who had torn apart the church had no final absolution, no assurance of salvation. After he died, the smell got worse. His body bloated fast. They packed him in lead-lined coffins, but the pressure built up. When the procession stopped at Syon Abbey on the way to Windsor, his corpse leaked. A thick black fluid seeped out of the coffin onto the floor of the chapel. A dog came in and licked it. The monks recorded this in their chronicle. They believed it was divine judgment. This wasn't poetic fiction. This was written down. A king who had slaughtered monks, stolen abbeys, and called himself the head of the Church of England, left a trail of leaking rot in a chapel. No clean ending, no divine light, just decay. When he was finally buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, they placed him next to Jane Seymour, his third wife, the only one he ever claimed to love. She died giving birth to Edward, and for that she was immortalized. The others were erased, one executed, one annulled, one disgraced, one dead in childbirth, one barely escaped. That was Henry's legacy. A dead tyrant, surrounded by lies, buried in lead, and remembered not for glory, but for fear. His court moved on fast. No statues were built, no grand national mourning, just a scramble for power, the same way it had always worked under Henry, the same way it always works under tyrants. They feared him alive, they used him dead, and England turned the page, quietly. When Henry VIII finally rotted into the floor of St. George's Chapel, he didn't leave behind a legacy. He left behind a mess. His 9-year-old son Edward became king the moment Henry died. But Edward wasn't in control. Edward Seymour, his uncle, took power as Lord Protector. What followed wasn't peace. It was a political brawl. The ruling elite tore into each other like wolves, the exact thing Henry had tried to prevent by dividing power across 16 men. It backfired instantly. Within 5 years, Seymour would be arrested and executed. And that was just the beginning. Henry had spent 3 decades rearranging the royal succession like a chessboard. He declared Mary illegitimate, then made her heir again, then did the same to Elizabeth. His will was full of contradictions, loopholes and power plays. So when Edward died young at 15, the country fell into chaos. Henry's oldest daughter Mary took the throne. She was Catholic. She reversed the Protestant reforms, rejoined the Pope, and burned 280 Protestants alive, trying to purge her father's legacy. They called her Bloody Mary. She earned it. Then came Elizabeth, Henry's daughter, by Anne Boleyn. She re-established Protestantism and ruled for 44 years. People call it a golden age, but Elizabeth grew up watching her father execute her mother. She learned early what absolute power really meant. Her entire reign was shaped by that trauma. And here's what most people don't understand. Henry VIII didn't build England. He broke it. He stripped the monasteries and funneled their wealth to the crown, yes. But he also destroyed 1,000 years of social infrastructure. Schools, hospitals, poorhouses, gone overnight, all for money. He killed thousands of people for heresy, while changing his own religious views every time it suited his politics. He turned friends into enemies, and enemies into corpses. He ruled by fear, and when that wasn't enough, by murder. What did he leave behind? A country divided by religion, a royal family filled with mistrust, a ruling class that learned to survive by lying, a people afraid to speak the truth. Henry VIII isn't remembered for good governance. He's remembered for power, unchecked, brutal, selfish power, the kind that can rewrite laws, execute wives, and silence dissent. And in the end, he died the way all tyrants do, bloated, alone, afraid of his own shadow. He thought people would remember his glory, but what stuck was the blood, the rot, the bodies. He built a kingdom on terror, and terror doesn't last. Today, school books reduce him to 6 wives and a few lines of church history. But the truth is, he ruled like a butcher and died like a coward. If you want to understand real history, this is it. Not stories of pageantry and divine right, but of greed, sickness, cruelty, and the slow collapse of a man who thought he was above judgment. Henry VIII was not a hero. He was not a reformer. He was not a tragic king. He was a tyrant who got away with everything until his own body dragged him to hell.